By Joel. There we go. We got it. We've got Gillian Coates talking about her trip to Churchill, Manitoba, and not just about polar bears. It's going to include a bunch of other stuff, so it's going to be extremely interesting. We're going to learn about Churchill, Manitoba as well. And I'll start off with our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the Burke Mountain Naturalists conduct their meetings and activities on the unceded core traditional territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, as well as the shared traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Squamish First Nations. We thank the people who continue to live on these lands and care for them. So does anybody actually have any questions before we get going? No? Okay. Since I was away, Brian probably explained some things, and we'll just turn it over to Gillian.
So Ian, I just regarding questions,
Yes.
because I can't see anybody when I'm actually presenting because I'm looking at my slides.
Yes.
Will you sort of take care of questions? Yeah. What I said while you stepped out was, what I'll do is pause probably a little way through and stop and see if people have got questions.
Sure. I'll monitor the chat if anybody has any questions coming in there. Otherwise, they can just hit their space bar and ask the questions.
Yeah. So I think if you don't mind, if you could hold your questions. And then
it says the speaker isn't working.
We can hear you, Elaine.
Okay. I'll pause and ask questions, see if there's any questions, and then we'll move on to the next bit. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. So let's begin. So my trip to Churchill started last summer. In the middle of the heat wave and the smoke, I just had a desperate need to get away somewhere. Couldn't get out of the country, and somehow or other, something came across my mind to go, I'll go and see polar bears in Churchill. Well, July isn't the time to go, but October, November is, and so I invited a friend to come with me, and we booked our trip, and we headed up to Churchill at the beginning of November of last year. So the highlight, so they're all the way through this presentation, you will see pictures of bears. We actually spent 2 days out on the tundra looking for polar bears. In total, we saw probably about 50. We don't know how many on the second day we were out were a repeat of the ones we saw, but we counted around 50 bears. There were a lot gathered, and I'll explain more kind of their life cycle and why they're where they are now, and why you can see them at this time of year and so on. I want to give credit to a couple of people. Most of the pictures are mine, but a few of the pictures, the particularly good ones, were a fellow traveler in our group by the name of Rick, who's from Nanaimo, and I haven't credited the particular pictures, but some of the best are his, and a couple I took off the internet because that was the only way I could get a picture. So I just wanted sort of summary of my presentation. So, like Churchill, why is Churchill where it is? What's its geography, a little bit of history, and the culture. And the polar bears, why do they gather in Churchill? Why is Churchill such a significant place for them? A little bit of their life story, and then a little bit more about our trip and what we saw and the experiences we had seeing polar bears. So Churchill, it's the north end of Manitoba. It's about 150 kilometers south of the Nunavut border. It's on the very mouth of the Churchill River, which is here, and on the shore of Hudson Bay. And please note, this was reinforced very carefully with us. It is not Hudson's Bay with an S on the end. It is Hudson Bay. So I have to pass that on to you. So a little bit more close up. Churchill is on this east bank, east spit of the very mouth of the river. And Churchill today, one of the significant parts is that it's a deep water port. And so this area is good for shipping because it is sheltered from the winds that howl across Hudson Bay. This area down here is Wapusk National Park, and that's actually a very significant, important area for the female polar bears to den when they have their cubs. And just a closer up of the town site. The town site is really tiny. It's about 3 streets right on this spit of land right at the mouth of the river. And it took me all the time I was there to try and orient myself, because I knew it was on the shore of Hudson Bay, but I was getting really confused because you'd go turn around on one side and you look out and you see water, and then you do a 180-degree turn and you see water on the other side. And because we were in the fog, we couldn't see the other shore. And it took me a long time to kind of get oriented and kind of understand the lay of the land. But as I say, these 2 streets and a couple of little streets in between, and that is the town of Churchill. This dotted line is the railway line that you see. Sorry, there. That goes all the way down to Winnipeg. And then out here, you can see that the land is this just very low level lying land, flat with these ponds all over the place. And it was in an area like this that we were taken out to see the polar bears. And we drove around in what would be called these tundra buggies to see the bears. Geography, for those who are interested, it's on the Canadian Shield, it's permafrost at the mouth of the river. And they're basically a junction of 3 ecosystems. So the south is the boreal forest, the northwest is the tundra, and to the north, and you could see the way Churchill lies north, is Hudson Bay itself. So a few views of what it looks like around town and outside town. So this is looking at the spit of land looking inland towards the other side, and that's the other side of the Churchill River. So just the edge of town and some of the industry. This low bush willows everywhere, and a very good place for bears to hide out, a very typical place where the bears do hide out. The trees there are really quite, stunted isn't the word, but they're not very big. These are black spruce, white spruce, tamarack. And the day we flew up, we actually flew up in fog. We got delayed taking off because of fog, and we got delayed landing because of fog. And absolutely still day, no wind, and everything was covered in hoarfrost. So it was really quite beautiful. Again, looking across, and you can see out here, it's a bank of fog, but it's actually looking out onto the Hudson Bay and then the intertidal zone. And you can see the tracks of the buggies that have gone around on these areas. So where it's frozen, it's clearly fresh water because it was too warm for the sea ice to have formed. So it may be very stark, but it's also really quite beautiful and quite stunning scenery. And yes, these are polar bear footprints in the snow. The other thing about this is, it dawned on me as we were looking at the coastline that one thing that was missing, there was very little driftwood, and understandably, because there aren't a lot of trees around there. So actually seeing a piece of driftwood made me go, oh, yeah, I haven't seen much of it. So Churchill history, it's the traditional territory of the Dene and the Cree people. The Inuit tend to live a little further north. The first European came in the 1600s, was Jens Munk, and he was actually looking for the Northwest Passage. Hudson Bay, within the next 50 years, established their fur trade post at York Factory, which is further south from Churchill. And Fort Churchill was only ever an outpost. It was never very significant for the fur trade. We had a long discussion as to which Churchill the town was named for. Well, it turned out to be John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, who was governor of the Hudson Bay in the 1600s when it was first established as a fort. First fort was burnt down, and I think the second fort was burnt down. So in 1799, 19, it was renamed the Prince of Wales Fort. And then in typical crazy British empire building fashion, the British decided that a wooden fort wouldn't do. They needed a proper fortification against the French in Hudson Bay. So they set out to build this large fortification, stone fortification, which they thought was going to take, planned that it would take 7 years. And it ended up taking about 40 because nobody knew how to build in the Arctic conditions. You know, the cement or wouldn't set, etc., etc. Pretty brutal conditions. So about 50 years after it was started, it was supposed to be fortification against the French. A French warship sailed into Hudson Bay. And the fort commander, I think, took one look at the French warships and said, yeah, hey, we've got an excuse to go home. So he surrendered without any fighting, and they all left and went back to England. And the French very quickly gave it up and gave it back to Hudson Bay. And it basically fell into disrepair because they had no use for it. So Hudson Bay Company was active in the area, fur trading, but obviously there wasn't much military activity until the 20th century. So in the 20th century, the rail line was conceived, and it was actually, when I was there, it dawned on me that Churchill's actually on, because it's on Hudson Bay, it is actually a direct access to salt water to Europe. For the prairies, never dawned on me that the prairies actually had direct connection to the Atlantic. And so it was a good way of shipping grain from the prairies to Europe. And it's about 2 weeks quicker than going through the Great Lakes because they can put it directly onto ocean-going freighters rather than having to put them on the grain onto the lake freighters and then transferring it. So obviously it's only open for part of the year, but when it is open, it's useful. You may remember the line was opened in 1929 from Winnipeg to Churchill, and it really opened up the north of Manitoba. There's stops all the way up to Churchill on the rail line. You may remember in 2017 there was a flood and a washout, and the line, was broken, and there was a huge argument that went on for months and months and months with the company and the government about who was going to pay for the repairs. And eventually, a consortium of northern companies got together and decided they were going to rebuild the line. So they now own the line, which really has much more ownership of keeping it open. And it was reopened in 2018. It was pretty tough for the town to have no rail connection for about 18 months. This is the grain elevator, and grain is still shipped through Churchill, not very much, but there is grain shipped. The railway line is really an essential supply line for heavy goods and materials going into Churchill nowadays. So it's quite an essential. The only other way to bring heavy goods is shipping, which would have to come from the St. Lawrence all the way around northern Quebec, which would be a hugely lengthy journey. Why don't I stop there? I see one chat. Are there any questions at this point? Any questions, Ian? Otherwise, I will move on.
What's the population?
I'm sorry?
What's the population of Churchill?
Right now, it's about 800 people.
And is tourism their only business?
Tourism, their main business. I will come to that in just a moment. So hang in there. If you don't mind, I'll come to that. Yeah. So when the rail line was closed, the town, they decided to have a mural festival just to sort of boost morale in the town. And all over the town on these big buildings, there was some beautiful murals. And this was one we came, it's a 3-story building close to the grain elevator. The grain elevator is actually down here. And it commemorating the men who worked on the rail line. It's a 3 stories, you can see, quite a big old industrial building. It was quite magnificent. And just a few of the other murals that we saw around town. So today, the 20th century, later in the 20th century, was a military base, and its height, there was about 4,000 people. It was part of the military, it was access to the north, supply line for the north, part of the Dew line. It closed in the mid 60s. After that, there was actually a rocket launch site, and you'll see on the right side of the screen there, here, you'll see this funny looking structure is actually a rocket launcher base. And they did a lot of atmospheric research, research on the Northern Lights up here in Churchill. And this whole area now is a Northern Studies Center, sort of university level research going on, multiple universities. And if you're interested, one of the things you can do is check out their learning vacations, Northern Studies Center, Churchill Learning Vacations. And you can go up there for a week and participate in research, get taken out on the tundra, etc. That looks like a really interesting way of going as well. So tourism, you mentioned tourism, is a big moneymaker in Churchill. Tourists started coming actually when the rail line opened, and we saw some lovely pictures of people coming up on the railway from the 1930s. Most people come by plane. It takes an hour from Winnipeg, but you can come by train, which is quite a lot more expensive and takes a lot longer if you want an adventure. Yeah. So yeah, population of about 800 people, permanent residents. The military left behind some good infrastructure. There's a little hospital there, high school, elementary school, and so on. This is actually Manitoba housing, and some other buildings around town that we saw. When the flood that I mentioned was actually as a result of a huge blizzard and snowstorm, and the snow, they showed us pictures, the snow actually came up to the roof of this house, of this lodge. There is a herd of caribou in the area, so clearly hunting is another part of life here. And this building is part of the Northern Study Center. I was really intrigued by these jacks that it was based on. It's clearly very prefabricated. And Ian suggested that actually what it does is allows the building to be kept level, so these jacks can be adjusted to different heights. It's probably a bit of permafrost here, and this building is likely to, you know, the ground is likely to change. So yeah, couple more. So everywhere you go, you see bears. These are down the main street. Bears are celebrated everywhere because they are such an important part of Churchill. And a nice little tourist spot looking out over Hudson's Bay. It looks remote, but actually just behind here is one of the main streets of Churchill. This looks out over Hudson Bay, and everywhere you go, you see signs, which are basically warning signs saying, don't go past this sign, look out for polar bears, you know, polar bears are dangerous, here's the number to call, etc. You are very, very aware that polar bears are around. And the weather in Churchill, I just thought this was kind of a fun sign. We had freezing fog, we had snow, we had cloud, we had a little bit of sunshine. We didn't have much wind, which, as I say, was unusual because the wind chill is a standard problem up in Churchill. And we didn't have cold temperatures. It was around 0 degrees centigrade. It should have been about -15 to -20. And that was a problem because the bears were waiting for the ice to freeze and it was delayed. So they get very hungry because they're waiting. So let me tell you a little bit about the polar bears. All these pictures were bears that we saw. So they spend their winters out on the sea ice hunting their primary diet of ring seals. The ring seals have a very, very thick layer of blubber, and that's what the bears eat. Once they've had their first fill of a seal, they actually strip the blubber and leave the meat, the flesh behind, and let the foxes and other animals scavenge for that. They survive just on the blubber. So they feast for 6 months or however long they can get out onto the ice. And once they come ashore, when the ice melts, they don't really eat. They're fasting for about 6 months. They come out to hang out. They may graze a bit, snack a bit, but they really don't waste energy hunting at all. And then they gather again as the weather cools off on the shores of Hudson Bay, waiting for the ice to freeze. So the animals, the females are a lot smaller than the males, as you can see there. And the females start mating when they're about 4 to 6, the males a little older. They live about 15 to 18 years. Biologists have managed to tag a few bears. Polar bears are actually really difficult to tag because they don't have a neck. If you look at a profile of a polar bear, it's like an arrow. So there's nothing to hang a radio collar on. It just falls off as soon as the bear puts its head down. So they've managed to figure out a way of gluing a GPS tracker onto their fur, which lasts for a few months, but it's not terribly successful. So they've got some data, but not as much as they would really like, and therefore not nearly as much as we've got of obviously black bears and grizzlies. They mate on the sea ice between April and June, and they have this interesting phenomenon where they delay the implantation of the fertilized eggs until the fall, until the female has actually got enough fat. So if she's a really fat bear, she can implant 2 or 3 eggs, and if she's not got enough fat, she may only implant one egg. They then find a den, and in December in the den their cubs are born. So they feast, they feed the cubs for about 3 months, and the females don't eat. They don't eat they're basically almost fasting for a year until they emerge in March, get out on the ice and start chasing seals again. When they emerge, they take the cubs out on the ice, and the cubs have to start learning to hunt right away. They stay with the mother for another full year until their second summer, until about 20 months, until their second summer, and then the cubs are shoved off on their own. And so the question then is, why Churchill? Why do the bears gather in Churchill? And it's really to do with the geography of the area. So fresh water obviously comes up the Churchill River, and this whole area here is fresh water. So the fresh water, as you know, freezes at a higher temperature. So the ice forms here earlier than it does out in Hudson Bay itself on the sea ice. And this ice here then flows out into the bay, and the currents in the bay sort of force the ice, and the wind forces the freshwater ice back onto the coast. And that freshwater ice seeds the sea ice. And so the sea ice starts forming earlier here than other parts along the coast. And so hence the bears have learned that this is a good place to wait, because they can get out onto the ice earlier in the winter than other places. And so that's why they gather in this area. So now we get on to our trip, and just take you through some of the story of our trip and what we saw, and you'll get
Gillian,
pictures of bears. Yes.
can we answer a couple of questions that are in the chat?
Absolutely. Good point to stop. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. John was asking how the population of polar bears are doing, and if you know if climate change has affected them.
Very much so. I mean, you can imagine if you rely on sea ice to find your food, the shorter the season when it's frozen, the shorter the time you have to catch your food. And so there is a big concern about that, because the winters are shorter and the summers are longer. So yes, that is a very big concern. And you'll be interested in a few slides later on, an organization, Polar Bears International, which is a consortium of organizations doing research on polar bears. Mm-hmm.
And another question, I'm not sure if you could answer or if anybody else could, but how do they delay implantation?
I'm sorry, that question I can't answer. You'd have to ask a animal biologist that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so polar bears, when you walk into the airport in Winnipeg, polar bears are obviously an important part of Manitoba culture. This was in the airport, not in Churchill, but in Winnipeg. So I thought that was, you know, a nice little, we've got, Metro Parks has cougars, they have bald eagles, and Winnipeg has polar bears to measure the length of the distance of social distancing. So I thought it was rather nice. Arrival in Churchill, and the first thing, this is in the airport, and the first thing you see is behavior around polar bears. And if you think of warnings around black bears and then warnings around grizzly bears, my sense is that polar bears are grizzly bears on steroids. Even in this state where they haven't eaten for a long time, they're fairly lethargic, they are very big, dangerous animals. And so I don't think it does the tour companies any good if they lose people to polar bear attacks. So, you know, all the rules around how to behave, and our guide constantly reinforced to us, you know, don't walk behind a building, don't walk behind a bus even, don't even step off the road into the bushes, because you never know when a polar bear is there. You know, they can wander around town, and they do wander around town. So they were very, very strongly reinforced this fact of not going, you know, not putting yourself in any danger. And then, you know, never go beyond an alert sign. Obviously don't feed a bear. And then walk after night at 10 o'clock. And we kind of wondered about that one. And they said, well, basically nobody in the town does. So if you're a tourist and you think you want to be out late at night, don't, because nobody else will be, and you'll be on your own. And you may very well walk around a corner and walk into a polar bear. So don't do it, is the message. They work really hard to keep people safe and to not have to control polar bears in any way other than they do some hazing to push them out of town, but that's it. So the company we were with was called, apologies. The company we were with, it was called Frontiers North Adventures. And I can't speak highly enough. They really were an excellent company. They looked after us very well and gave us a really excellent experience. They've been the tourist operator there for 30 years. There's a couple of new companies coming in, but these were the guys were great. Very well organized, good guides, fed us well, organized some interesting experiences, as well as seeing polar bears. So they do trips in the summer to see the belugas, which feed in that area, and it's a great birding area as well. The polar bears are obviously October, November, and then they have some really good Northern Lights trips, February, March, and that's the time when they actually have the most clear nights to see the Northern Lights in the winter. So so it's a great time. So this is what's called the tundra buggy, and this is what we traveled around in the area where we went to see the bears. So it's about 15. This is about 15 feet off the ground. This is probably about 6. Yeah, pretty high. To get onto the bus, they wouldn't allow us to kind of walk around. So we got off the little tourist bus that took us out of town to the area, and then basically parked the bus right at the edge of a loading platform. We went up some wooden steps along a platform that was raised, and then climbed onto this viewing area at the back of the bus, back of the buggy. And that's where we spent our day, driving around, looking for the bears. It was very comfortable inside. Kind of like a comfy school bus type arrangement inside, but much more spacious. So the first place they took us when we arrived was Polar Bear Jail. This is an old hangar from the military days, which is right next to the airport. it's the holding facility where they take problem bears that won't leave town any other way. So they capture the bears in a bear trap, tow them in here, put them into a cage in here, and keep them here for a few weeks, I think. If the ice has formed, they'll let them out onto the ice. If the ice hasn't formed, they'll tranquilize them and fly them further up the coast. And you could see another mural. So it's really quite a big facility. I mean, this doorway was about 15 feet high off the ground. It's not small. And the usual bear traps, but I would say our black bear traps probably are about this height off the ground. These polar bear traps are huge. And this is the kind of sign you will see everywhere. They have a conservation officer team there to work on. They're the ones who pick up the phone and answer the phones if you report a bear sighting. So once we got out onto the ice, this is the kind of view we saw. And so we started scanning the horizon for bears. And then you see a lot of white blobs, and then you realize they're rocks. And then you see a white blob, and then you start honing in on it a bit, and you realize it's a polar bear lying on the snow. And then you look out of the bus and you realize you're looking down on polar bear tracks right beside the bus. What I can't do is give you any perspective because we were not allowed to get off the bus to look more closely at these polar bear tracks because we were in the polar bear area. But we drove it. We thought we were doing well when we saw the bears in the distance. And then the further we got, the closer we got. And yes, I was using a telescopic lens for these, but I don't really have a very big zoom. So these were really not that far away from our bus. What you'll notice is some of them are quite fat and some of them are skinnier. We were given a little card with a gauge as to whether they were very fat, thin or skinny. And obviously they're monitoring the state of the bears in terms of their health. You'll see a lot of them just lying around. They love lying. They get really, really hot. You can imagine with thick fur. So they like lying in the snow. They love it when it's -20. It was really rather warm for them at 0 degrees. So these two birds tend to be solitary. They don't really like, in this area, there were a lot together, but they weren't gathering as like a flock of animals. They really wanted their own space. And so there's a sort of eyeing each other up and, who's going to charge who. They don't want to get into big fights, but they will get into growling matches and sort of swatting each other sometimes if one gets too close to the other. They really don't particularly care for each other. Seeing as we're looking at polar bear ecology, about the only way you can tell if a polar bear is male or female because of their thick fur is looking at their rear end. The females, the rear end tends to be rather stained yellow from the urine. And that's about the only way. So, and it's not always accurate, but that, so I'm guessing that is male because his rear end is pretty clean. But I can't tell you for sure. Yeah, so we saw a lot of this sort of wandering around, flopping down in the bush. And you'll note this is another buggy up here. And we very often, if it was a good viewing area or a bears that were collecting in a few in a location together, there would be there might be 3 or 4 or 5 of these buggies gathered around. And there's a kind of like whale watching, there's a fairly strict etiquette of how close they can get to the bears and what they can do and can't do, etc., when they're out viewing. So it's very well controlled, very well managed, I would say. So just a few of the other wildlife that we saw. Ian and I had a conversation yesterday. That bird, I think I'm pretty sure I know what it is. But if anybody wants to hazard a guess, I got really excited about what it was, but then I kind of got disappointed. So anybody want to hazard what they think it is? Any hands up, Ian?
Looks like a house sparrow.
Yeah, that's what I think. I'm pretty sure. Thank you. Was that Larry?
That was Larry, and also Victoria chimed in saying house sparrow.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain it was a house sparrow. I got so excited when I first saw it and then got disappointed. And the old whiskey jack. Yeah. We did see a snowy owl. I'm sorry, I don't have pictures of the other birds I saw. We did see a snowy owl. We did see some little flocks of snow buntings, and we saw perhaps a harrier or a gyre falcon. I wasn't quite sure. We saw some ptarmigan and a few other things as well. So this red fox very obligingly walked across the road right in front of us and into the bush, and then posed beautifully for us. The red foxes really live further south. They're actually moving north into this area and pushing out the smaller, the shyer Arctic foxes. So again, that's another impact of climate change. And then we saw some lovely flocks of ptarmigan in the willow bushes in among the bears. So we had the inevitable dog sled experience, which was actually a lot of fun. I was a bit sort of dubious about it before we went, but it was actually a lot of fun. And if anybody doubts that dogs are made to run, forced to run, you can see this dog. He was just pulling on his harness as hard as he could, waiting for the sled to be released so they could head down the track. They were so excited and, you know, clearly loved to run. So it was a fun morning. So this is the organization I was mentioning earlier when you asked the question about conservation, John. Polar Bears International is a consortium of groups, organizations around the Arctic who are doing research on polar bears. And obviously it's a good place to have a site, a location, an office in Churchill with all the people coming up. So this girl is doing some research on polar bears. And so she was she's finishing up her PhD on polar bears, on one aspect of their feeding habits. And so she was talking really about the impact of climate change, exactly that. And so you can see this little blackboard, it says actually 145 days. The Western Hudson Bay polar bears have been off the ice, the sea ice, for 145 days. And so that's how long, you know, this was last year waiting. And we were there beginning of November, and it was another 3 weeks, the beginning of December, before the ice formed enough so that they could leave Churchill and go out on the ice. Very, very informative, very well presented. And I just point out this cam, this video screen, this is actually a live cam. One of the tundra buggies has a camera on top, kind of like like a Google Earth camera. And they live stream these videos of the bears out on the ice. And so you can actually go onto the Polar Bears International website and look at live cams and see these live videos from Churchill. Or else they will have, if it's nighttime, they'll have highlights from the day. So you get some really great shots of the bears if anybody's interested. That just happens in October, November, but it's a fun thing to do. So when we came back, I kept going on the website looking at bears and seeing what they could see. So just coming near the end, sort of last few pictures of bears here. Just, yeah, as I say, lying around. Have a look and you'll see that there are actually two bears in this picture. And this was kind of an interesting encounter because we saw this bear lying down and then all of a sudden she jumped up, she jumped up and realized this bear was coming around from here in the bushes. And we weren't sure if this one had seen this one. And we were kind of waiting for a rather aggressive encounter. But in the end, they did see each other and this guy decided, no, he'd had enough and off he wandered again. But it's that sort of, oh, somebody's coming into my space. I don't want them. But you see how easily it is for these bears to hide, especially when it's snow on the ground. And, you know, if you're wandering in the willows, you would never see, you would so easily miss a bear and encounter a bear. And you can be sure that you will not come off. You will come off worse if you encounter a bear. These guys we came across a beach and it was really intriguing because there's 4 or 5 of them sort of spread out on the beach, and then this guy wandered down to the shoreline and started delving into the kelp, and he actually started eating the kelp, but really he wasn't getting very much nutrition out of it. It was just sort of snacking on it, probably just something to do. But what you see is this big scar, and a lot of the bears had scars around the sort of bloody areas around their face, a lot of scarring around their faces, and they are very, very aggressive, and they will fight each other, especially out on the ice. And I think in mating season, I'm sure the males are quite aggressive, trying to catch the females. So when you see 2 together like this, you kind of wonder, but the only time they will be together, either this was a mother and cub, or these were 2 siblings together. You would not get this otherwise. And then the highlight came at the very end of the trip. We came around the corner and we saw these 4 bears sort of gathered on, this was a frozen pond. And a couple of these guys were quite funny because they were going through the ice, and he's got his paws through the ice. And as we watched them for a while, we realized that this was actually a family group. These were 3 cubs and mom. And when we realized that, we noticed how excited the guides got on our bus. And as I say, we'd asked them, I think the day before, of whether they'd seen any triplets, and they said no, not for a very long time. And so to actually see them, to actually see, my apologies, I don't mean to, I accidentally hit the camera, hit the advance sometimes. To actually see these together was so exciting. So these cubs would be, I guess, 10 or 11 months old, because they would have been born December of 2020. And we watched them playing on the rock, pushing each other around, chasing each other around, just behaving like adolescents behave. And then we started to see, and these were probably 2 young males, but we couldn't tell, fighting each other. And that was, as I say, the highlight of our trip. And pretty well after we'd seen that, we had to go back. We left this area of viewing and we went straight to the airport and came back to Winnipeg. But it was such a memorable end to a really wonderful 4 days in Churchill. So, yeah.
Great. So, sure. And so we can take some questions if anybody has any questions.
I'm just wondering what the cost was.
It wasn't a cheap trip. It was, yeah, it was, I think it was about $7,000. It was, yeah, it was an all-inclusive trip. So it included everything from Winnipeg back to Winnipeg. There were some people who actually flew up from Winnipeg for the day. So they were on the same plane as we were. They literally got off the plane, got straight on a bus, went straight out to view the bears, got back on the plane at 6 o'clock at night and came back to Winnipeg. So I felt for them because the fog was delaying us. And I can imagine sitting there in Winnipeg going, oh my goodness, are we going to get there? But we were very fortunate we did. Very good pilots took us in under the fog. John, I think you had something there about the delayed implantation. Yeah, they do that. I think the question was, how do they do that? And I suspect that that's about complex biology. That
well, actually, what happens is the fertilization of the egg stops for the next 4 months.
Okay.
And that allows the females then to feed during that period, build up their store of fat, so that when they're ready to reinitiate the fertilization, then they can go without feeding, as you pointed out.
Yeah. I think part of it is, well, how do they know, what is the trigger for them to control the number of eggs that implant? If they're a bit underweight, they only implant 1, and if they've got enough fat sources, they'll implant 2, and if they're really fat, they'll implant 3. What's the trigger for that? And we didn't have a discussion. Question there about how does the male bear tell a female? I imagine it's odor. I don't know. That's the usual animal way of telling male and female apart. So I'm guessing that that's what it is. I'm sorry, I don't know.
I had a question about predators. It didn't really seem like the polar bears have got too much in the way of predators other than maybe humans.
I think that's right. Humans and each other.
Right.
So that, the big males will attack cubs. The females are very protective of their cubs, keep them away from the big males because they will attack the cubs. But other than that, it is simply humans that are a problem.
And Victoria was asking, did you interact with the Dene or other First Nation people?
We did actually. We had a fascinating talk by a couple who were actually they were Cree. They were fur trappers, and this fellow and his wife have been living in Churchill area, and they go out trapping every winter. They've been doing that for years and years and years. And so they described the way they go out trapping. They showed us some of their traps and they talked about the different animals that they trap. And so we asked about, the fur trade and who buys the furs. And we gather it's the Koreans and the Chinese, and a lot of Asians still buy the furs. There's a big fur auction in Winnipeg. I can't remember when it is, and that's when they sell their furs. So he and his wife take their vacations. They go out, I think it was December, he said, for about 6 weeks. He's got trap lines and he goes out and sets his traps and goes out. He was bemoaning the fact that many of the younger generation are not interested in trapping anymore. He was kind of sad that none of his children or grandchildren were following in his footsteps. He's obviously a very experienced guy. He really knows the animals. He knows the wildlife there. He talked about a time when the wolf population got rather large and was causing problems for the caribou herd, because the caribou herd is quite small there, and so they were asked to go out and trap some of the wolves and sort of a little bit of population control to help the caribou. So yeah, some of that. So that was really very interesting. And then the guy who was running the dog sled, he was a Métis guy, and he was really quite funny actually. So we had some stories from him as well. So yeah, that was our opportunity to interact with some of the First Nations people, which was quite very enjoyable, very interesting.
And accommodation wise, most of it only used part of the year, I guess.
I would guess so. The hotel we stayed in was a very, very comfortable, warm and comfortable, fairly simple accommodation. In town there were about 2 or 3 hotels in town, and then there were about 2 restaurants in town. So we ate some of our meals at one restaurant, which was across the street from our hotel, and some of our meals at the other restaurant, which was just 2 blocks down the road. Excellent food. We had some great meals. We had Arctic char. We had, I certainly had elk, a couple elk meal, bison burgers. Yes, some very, very, very good food. High quality food came out of the kitchen. And some very good beer, because they had a local brewery up there as well, which was fun too. And it was delightful because the staff in the restaurants were all, they were mostly young waitresses, and we chatted them a bit, and yes, I'm from here. Yes, I grew up here. Yes, I love it here. And no, I don't want to leave. They've been down to Winnipeg to university, but they love coming back home to Churchill. They love it. So that was really delightful. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for your overview of Churchill as a community. I was not aware there was a fort there. That was a bit a surprising thing that anyone ever felt they had to build a fort. I can only imagine the difficulties they had in the winter temperatures and so on. So thank you.
Thank you. The British did some really crazy things. Yeah.
I sort of think about it because they were looking for, ocean, I guess, ocean access from the land, and it's not any different than North Road here. That North Road was built simply to have saltwater access from New West.
That's true. Probably not such challenging conditions though.
No, not at all. Or as cold winters.
Or as cold winters, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, I think that will come to an end unless anybody's got any questions.
Well, thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you, John. Thank you for
It's
joining
fabulous,
me.
Gillian. It's great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Jim, Jim, is that your hands up or applause?
Oh, that was applause.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Real applause.
Thank you very much, Gillian.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining me.
Great. And thanks everybody for coming out, and come back for our meeting in, what do we know, going into May, I guess. So we'll see you next time then, and check out our website as we do have some outings and work parties coming up.
And the YouTube recording of this will be up on our YouTube channel in probably about 24 hours. So you can enjoy Gillian again.
Thanks, Brian. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night.